Last night, Atlanta's trendiest nightclub was more than just a party. It was a war zone of emotions, drama, and raw intensity. Imagine a full dance floor that was trembling. The room's strobe lights slashing through the thrown cocktails, flowing the city's elite mingling, and the atmosphere at an all-time high. Yet in the thick of everything, Kirk Frost and young Jock entered the party with a serious purpose in mind, and their target was Lil Scrappy, a man who could light up any room with his magnetic presence. It began with slow, chilly steps, whispered conversations, a tempest seeping under the surface. Then everything burst, the mood switched in an instant, voices went harsh, and suddenly the center of the dance floor became a battleground. Phones sprang up recording every second. Some were too terrified to respond. This wasn't just a heated argument. It was a full-fledged face confrontation that had the entire club on edge. But what drove? Kirk and Jock confronted Scrappy so aggressively, and how far did it go before security had to step in? The night had barely just begun, but inside Atlanta nightclub, the vibe was already electrifying, the type of night that people speak about for weeks. Loud music, flashing lights, and a throng that growing wilder. The queue outside extended around the block, packed with the city's most connected and fashionable faces. If you had status, this was place to be. Inside, the dance floor surged with energy. Strobe lights flashed and sump with the pounding bass, revealing views of people engrossed in the music at the bar. Groups gathered around cocktails, trying to be heard over the thunderous pounding. Wherever you looked, people were in their zone. But up in the VIP area, things were different. The air wasn't about celebration, but about something brewing beneath the surface. Kirk Frost and young Jock sat in their own booth, entourages swarming around them. They looked the part: designer clothes, expensive drinks, the aura of success. Yet Kirk's grin didn't quite reach his eyes, and Jock's laughing felt forced. A tension existed between them, unnoticeable to most but impossible to ignoring. The people around them either didn't notice or didn't care too much, caught up in the pleasures of being in the orbit of two famous names across the room. Another VIP booth, Lil Scrappy was the star of his own party. As Kirk and Jock were buried in thought, Scrappy was pure energy. His laughter broke through the music, his motion smooth, his charisma unmistakable. He wasn't just there, he commanded the place. People drew toward him, glasses clinked, and every Scrappy had always been the type of man who transformed an ordinary night into an extraordinary one, and today was no exception. Different, but under the surface things were moving. Kirk and Jack kept gazing toward Scrappy's booth, slight at first, a gaze here and a murmur. Conversation there, but as minutes passed, it became evident. Kirk pushed in, voice low but eager, and Jock's visage darkened. Whatever they were discussing, it wasn't simply casual talk. The air around them altered. A waitress serving drinks halted, sensing the shift. Her eyes flicked between Kirk's clenched jaw and Jock's furrowed eyes before immediately moving on. Meanwhile, at Scrappy's table, the mood remained electric, unaffected as he went toward the dance floor. Stopped to meet a few familiar acquaintances, raising his drink in acknowledgement. If he felt the weight of their stares, he didn't show it. Watched him, his jack tightening. He went closer to Kirk. "You seeing what I'm seeing?" He mumbled over the pounding bass. Kirk didn't respond straight away. Eyes kept glued on Scrappy's every motion. Eventually, he nodded. "Yep," he said, voice measured. "I see it. There was history here, one of the most in the club." Outsiders were unaware that the three guys had crossed paths for years, showing up at the same events and sharing the same circles. Their contact looked. Scrappy's unvarnished confidence and expanding influence have made him a popular among. To Kirk and Jock, it wasn't just about him. It was about what he represented, his unshaken confidence and ability to grab attention. The way he danced like nothing could touch him was a message, and for some, that statement was unwelcome. The DJ switched songs and the dance floor. When lights flashed faster, folks drew tighter, and the club's intensity touched its pinnacle. That's when Kirk and Jock stood up. Their moves were intentional. Without saying anything, they continued pushing through the crowd, cutting directly for Scrappy. Meanwhile, Scrappy got immersed in the moment and nodded to the supporters. Chanting his name, raised his glass, and kept the enthusiasm alive. But the others around him knew it coming. The atmosphere altered, and then boom. By the time Scrappy looked up, it was too late. They were already there. Kirk halted only a few feet away, hidden in his pockets, while Jock drew in closer. The music, the flashlights, and the distant laughter receded into the background, leaving a crushing quiet. Scrappy dropped his glass slightly, his typical grin fading and his posture straightening as he assessed them up. "What's going on, fellas?" he inquired, his tone easygoing but cautious. Behind him, his crew stirred, and a couple of them rose up, their eyes flickering between Kirk and Jock. Nobody uttered a word, but the tension in the room was difficult to ignore. Even the observers surrounding them could feel it. Kirk didn't speak right away. He studied. Scrappy's expression was inscrutable, and then eventually, "You've been running your mouth," Kirk remarked, voice low, even stirring up drama. "You know precisely what I'm saying." Talking about Scrappy's grip tightened on his drink. He cocked an eyebrow, but the typical confidence in his voice shook. "I don't know what you mean." His voice was solid, but something about his posture betrayed him. His eyes flickered toward his booth, where his team was now fully aware. They muttered among themselves, but no one moved. This was Scrappy's war, and he knew it. "If you've got anything to say," he continued, going back to them and saying it. His body language was calm and controlled, but his eyes conveyed a different tale. "We have a lot to say," Jock said. Scrappy's voice was piercing enough to cut through the cacophony. "And if you're wise, you'll listen." He didn't flinch. In fact, his position got harder. His tone slid toward defiance. His free hand curling into a fist at his side, he took a step forward, now standing nearly toe-to-toe with among the audience. Around them moved. Some stepped aside. Others leaned in, lured in by the tug of an imminent explosion. At that moment, the nightclub wasn't about the music, it wasn't about the drinks, it wasn't about the party, and the area where Kirk Frost, young Jock, and Lil Scrappy stood had transformed into something completely else. Scrappy's crew was uneasy, with some standing and others loitering near the booth, their eyes darting between the three guys. Their whispers were fast. Nobody wanted to make the first move, but everyone could feel what was coming. Jack spoke first. "You know what this is about," pointing a finger. "Scrappy, you've been spreading lies for a long time and believe you can say whatever you want without being held accountable." Scrappy raised his chin, his jack tightening. "If I have anything to say, I'll say it," he shouted back. "But don't come at me with weak allegations unless you." Scrappy, Kirk added. "We have receipts." With a rapid swipe, he unlocked his phone and held up the screen, the brightness of the gadget reflecting off Scrappy's face. He struggled to make out the details, but he didn't need to see it. The weight of Kirk's actions said everything. Scrappy's jaw stiffened. "So what now?" he said. "You're going to show me some out-of-context signals. That's your proof." He let out a scoff, waving a dismissive hand. "He missed me with that rubbish." But his voice wasn't as steady as before. Lely's arrogance was still there, but his attitude had shifted ever so slightly, a subtle shift that only happens when somebody starts to feel the walls. Approaching, and Jock made another stride, now stood shoulder to shoulder with Kirk. "This isn't out of context," Jock stated. His voice was lower now, sharper, dead serious. "You've been playing both sides, saying one thing to us and another to everyone else." Then he leaned in. "It's time to own up before this gets worse." Scrappy's, he planted his feet, set his shoulders, and locked eyes with the two guys. "You think you can come in here and press me?" His voice cut through the cacophony louder now. "Who do you think you are?" Heads turned from surrounding tables. Talks hushed. The nightclub's pulse didn't stop. The bass still pounded. The lights flashed, but in this corner of space, all focus was on them. A tiny throng gathered at the perimeter, pulled in by the fire blazing. Kirk didn't flinch across from him. His voice was measured and controlled, but there was steel below. "This is greater than you realize." He leaned in. "Just you keep running your mouth, and it's not only going to damage you, it's going to hurt everyone around you. So maybe think about that before you keep pushing your luck." The words fell hard. Scrappy breathed slowly and deeply. His fingers clenched at his sides and his shoulder tense. "If you have anything to say," he said, voice low, boiling, "tell it now, because I'm done playing games." Behind him, His team tightened formation, pressing in closer. They didn't talk, but their presence said enough. A loose semicircle formed behind him, a wall of quiet support. Jock grinned, shaking his head. "You already spoken too much. Stated we're simply here to make sure you know we're not letting it slip." And then suddenly Kirk took a step forward, near enough for Scrappy to feel the Kirk mumble. His voice almost buried behind the music, but yet strong enough to cut through the tension. Scrappy didn't move, didn't blink. His heart hammered, but his voice was firm. "You don't fear me," he whispered. "You never did that." Jock's fists tightened. Kirk's eyes sharpened, and Scrappy's gang drew even closer, their muscles coiled and ready for anything. The audience was on the verge of bursting when a solid hand cut through the moment and landed on Kirk's shoulder. "That's enough." A security guard, large, no-nonsense voice, quiet but heavy with authority. "Take it outside or take a seat." Kirk didn't move at first. His eyes were Jock took a step back, rolling his shoulders, but his stance remained rigid. Scrappy breathed slowly, his visage unshaken, shifted position, but the fire in his eyes never dimmed. The security officer wasn't playing, so he motioned toward their booths and said, "I don't care who you are. Stone, this is not the place for that." For a single second, it appeared like Kirk and Jock would push back, but the air was still heavy with the weight of everything. Murmured, but then Kirk placed his phone back into his pocket. "We'll settle this another time," he muttered, voice low, just loud enough for Scrappy to hear. Jack provided. Scrappy gave one more glance before turning away. No more words, no more threats, just silent promises. They moved back toward their VIP area, vanishing. Scrappy didn't move immediately away. His breath was still a bit heavy, and his hands were still buzzing from the adrenaline. A hand dropped on his shoulder. One of his. Scrappy blinked, forcing himself to ease back into the present. "I'm good." He picked up his drink, took a leisurely sip, and looked toward his. Booth's voice was calm and steady, but there was an edge behind it. They were all talking. He let the words settle, as he usually had, but as he sat down, that sensation in his instinct wouldn't let him go. The way Kirk and Jock stared at him and approached him wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. As the night progressed, the tension grew thicker and settled into the air like smoke that refused to disperse. Kirk and Jock returned to their booth. But the vibe was different now. Their drinks lay untouched, their banter non-existent. They weren't just two men out for a good time anymore. Scrappy tried his best to shrug it off while watching and waited for their next move on the other side of the club. He reclined back in his booth, drink in hand. Grin remained on his lips, but those who knew him best saw through it. His team stayed close, their discussions muted, their eyes darting toward Kirk and Jock every several minutes. The entire club sank off like a storm hovering just above, waiting to break, and suddenly the whisper initiated what had been a private standoff. People mumbled about what they'd witnessed, exaggerating every detail like storytellers weaving a narrative about one woman. Near the bar, leaning close to her buddies, her talk was low but urgent. "I believe Kirk and Jock were going to set it off." Meanwhile, a man at the other end of the room laughed as he told his own man. Scrappy stood them down like a champ. They didn't want any, it didn't matter. Although no fists had been thrown, the rumors took on a life of their own. Then the phones came out and a shaky video circulated on social media. Only a few seconds. The tape recorded from across the room didn't show much. Just Kirk and Jock standing in front of Scrappy, the weight of the occasion palpable in the air, yet that was enough. Within minutes, the hashtag started trending. The club staff did their utmost to keep the night rolling, but they understood the truth. This wasn't simply another celebrity spat. Their club had just become the center of a viral moment. Back in VIP, Kirk checked his phone. His mouth knotted as he read through flood of comments. "They're talking like we're the bad guys," he murmured, his voice low, controlled but tight with fury. "Like we began this documentary." Kirk looked at the screen and shook his head. "It's just noise," he murmured, but after a beat, "Maybe it's time we put the record straight." He nodded, but his eyes did not soften. "Okay," he replied, tucking his phone into his pocket. "We need to handle this." While on the other side of the bar, Scrappy's group was watching similar firestorm unfolded on their screens. One of his lads turned his phone toward him, smirking. saying you're a legend, dubbing you the king of the club. Scrappy let out a brief laugh, but there was no amusement in it. His fingers pounded over his glass, and his eyes flickered toward Kirk and Jock's booth. Well, he mumbled, but we both know they're not done with this. He took a cautious sip of his drink. Without breaking his stare, they're sitting over there scheming. He laid the glass down with a quiet clink. You think this is finished? He sighed, shaking his head. No, they're just getting started. As the club closed, the intensity outside was just as intense as it had been inside. People stayed in the parking lot, still buzzing, sharing stories, and speculating about what had begun as a confrontation was now a full-blown saga. This wasn't just a night out anymore. It was a moment, a tale that had the city talking within. Kirk and Jock eventually rose up. They hadn't touched another drink, hadn't needed to speak anything, and the air between them was dense with unsaid plans. Kirk looked forward the exit. Let's leave, he said without hesitation. Jock followed without looking back. No words exchanged, just a silent vow that this wasn't the end. Across the room, Scrappy watched them depart with his jaw tightened, thinking they'd just walk out of here and come after me another day. His voice was low, almost to himself. Of his buddies leaned in speaking, but Scrappy shook his head. His eyes remained focused on the door. Nah, he murmured. This ain't over. Outside, the night air was cool, but the tension was still heavy. A gathering had formed around the valet. Folks going through their phones, conversing, disputing. Kirk and Jock passed past. With silence, their presence splitting the throng like a wave through water, they climbed inside their car doors, gently closing them. The illumination of their phones lit up the interior as they read through the web maelstrom. The comments were a battleground, some applauding Scrappy, some asking for Kirk and Jock to drop. Kirk's visage clouded as he replied, "You know what we need to do, Jock." I peered over his inscrutable face, but he nodded, knowing they didn't need it. To put it simply, the club drama was the big fight was coming up next. That's where we stand, and the tension is simmering. A storm is building as alliances shatter. Behind the scenes, here's the truth. Question: what do you believe happened in that club? Is Kirk and Jock's side? Is the narrative legitimate, or is Scrappy merely the latest target of those behind the scenes? Tell us about your power play in the comments. And believe me, you don't want to miss what happens next. Enjoy this video. Subscribe. Turn on the alerts because it is far from over.